Good morning. Excuse me. I wish to make a short statement in order to put a matter on public record. The next witness is Deborah Coles. Co-participants and others will recall that at the preliminary hearing, when I introduced my assessor, Raju Bhatt, I mentioned that as a solicitor, he had over many years represented families who had lost members through death in custody. In addition, he had been a member of various review groups and panels. Given the nature of his involvement in that type of work, Mr. Bhatt knows Deborah Coles and has had a professional relationship with her and INQUEST over the years. Could we now have the witness in? Good morning, Miss Coles.
Good morning.
Will you raise your hand and say the words of the oath? I swear by Almighty God.
Sorry, I was going to affirm.
Will you wish to affirm? Certainly. Will you say these words after me? I solemnly, sincerely and truly
I solemnly, sincerely and truly
declare and affirm
that
I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
and
nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
Miss Graham.
Thank you. Good morning, Miss Coles.
Good morning.
You are Deborah Coles.
I am.
May I ask what age you are?
61.
And you are the Executive Director of INQUEST, based in London, as I understand it.
Yes, that's correct.
And you've held that particular post in INQUEST since around February 2017, is that right?
Yes, prior to that I was a co-director, and prior to that I was somewhat bizarrely named joint organiser.
Right. No doubt a very busy job.
Yes, indeed.
And I understand you've worked for INQUEST since 1989, is that correct?
Correct.
And they are a charity.
Yes.
Now, my understanding, and please correct me if I'm wrong, is that there is no similar organisation in Scotland to INQUEST that families of bereaved people could attend or seek advice from. And actually, in the UK, INQUEST is unique in the role that they play.
That's correct.
Before I ask you about your contact with the inquiry and your statements and your work with INQUEST and involvement with the family of Mr. Bio, am I right in saying that you would like to say just a few words at the outset, and you've sought the permission of the chair to do so?
That's right.
Would you like to take an opportunity now to say something?
Yes, as everybody's aware, I've known the family of Sheku since his passing, but I wanted to take this opportunity to pay my respect and honour the family for their courage and commitment to finding out the truth about how Sheku died. I know from my work the real emotional and physical toll that this plays on families, not least when a process lasts many, many years, and how it disrupts family life, careers, and the fact that they have attended this inquiry every single day of this hearing, I think is a real testament to their love for Sheku. And I felt it was very important I had the chance to share that.
Thank you very much. Can I begin, first of all, by looking at your contact with the inquiry? I'm aware that you've attended some previous hearings and watched some evidence, and you may then be aware that there is a blue folder sitting in front of you on the desk. And you may have heard me speak to other witnesses about the blue folder. Now, you've provided 2 statements to the inquiry, which I'm going to come on to in a moment, but we're aware that some witnesses prefer to have a hard copy in front of them. And if you're one of those witnesses, then please feel free to use those hard copies in any way that you wish to do so. If you want to scribble on them, if you want to look through them, they're yours and for your use during your evidence today.
Thank you.
And as you will have seen with previous hearings, when I have a part of your statement I'd like to refer you to, it will come up on the screen in front of you. And if there's anything that you think I should also be looking at in addition, please let me know what the paragraph number is and we'll have it on here. If we don't have a document that you would find helpful, we will try and get it at the next break, or we'll try and get it over lunch. Can we look first of all at the first statement you gave to the inquiry? I think initially there was what we are calling a Rule 8 request, which was a written request from the inquiry for you to prepare a written response to the inquiry. I will call that your first statement, if I may. And the request is SPPI 00592. And we can see that on the screen. That was the list of questions that you were sent. Mm-hmm. And then your response is SBPI 00366, and we'll see that coming up on the screen. So that was your first response there, in light of the response request from the inquiry. And if we look at this, first of all, you will see on the final page that it was signed on the 14th of September 2023. Yeah. And we look at the last page. There we are. Now this is the final page, but am I right in saying every page was signed by you?
Yes.
And now we have a redacted copy, so it won't, your signature isn't on screen, but your own copy should have your signature.
Yes, indeed, it does.
And the date of signature is the 14th of September 2023.
Yep.
Now that's 40 pages long, and if we go back to the top, I'll just summarise that the format of this is that we identified a number of themes that we were particularly interested in asking you about, and you've gone through those commenting. Yeah. You've added in quotations from families that you've dealt with over the years. I think you have a section for each topic called the family voice. Mm-hmm. And are these actual quotations from families you have dealt with in INQUEST over the years?
Yes, and they will largely have come from family listening days that we will have been commissioned to hold on behalf of different organisations or different government commissioned reviews. For example, the review conducted by Lady Ailish Angelini.
Now, we heard from Lady Angelini last week, and she told us about the family listening days that were conducted as part of one of her reports. Could you tell us just a little bit about how you organise those and what the format is?
Yeah, I mean, in the context of the Angelini review, we were commissioned by the Home Office, as part of the review, to hold family listening days. And these are days that have been designed to bring together a group of bereaved families to share their experiences of the investigation and inquest processes that follow deaths. And if I talk specifically about the Angelini review, that would have been deaths in police custody and following police contact. So those families are brought together and then they are taken through the journey, pre-police contact, post-death, and then through the investigation systems, and then either the inquest or, in the unusual event, there's any other legal action. And the whole purpose behind them is to hear direct family testimony about their experiences, but also families' ideas for change, how processes could be improved, any examples of good practice. So they are very much family testimony, and then they are those days are written up into reports which are then made public. And for the Angelini review, I think that the 2 days that we held very much informed the recommendations that she made, particularly around family experience, treatment of families, but also about the investigation systems.
And so in the Angelini report, I think, which is the death in custody report from 2017, the family listening days the record of that formed an appendix to her report?
Correct.
And we've heard about that. And for you, your statement, which we see on the screen, the family voices with quotation marks, that will contain similar quotations and remarks made by families who've been in this situation.
Yes. There will also be quotes from a family listening day that we ran for what was then the Independent Police Complaints Commission. So what I tried to do in this statement is draw out quotations from families that I thought would assist in documenting their experiences and their suggestions for change.
So whatever the topic we've asked you to give your statement on,
Yes.
you've sought statements and quotations from family members, and the chair can have regard to that as well.
Yes.
Thank you. And then you've also in this statement given us a section called best practice. And I'm interested in the main aim that you had in providing that section.
I suppose when I was considering how this statement could best assist the inquiry, it was to draw on my experience of this work and my involvement in other reviews and inquiries, and to try and ensure that I use that expertise to help inform this inquiry, consider what recommendations the chair might like to make, to, I suppose, draw on what we know has gone wrong in the past, but also what we know can best work, particularly around the treatment of bereaved people, and also for more effective investigations and accountability.
So the best practice section will reflect the learning from the families by INQUEST, and will reflect possible changes that could be implemented to assist families, make life easier for
Yes.
them, to provide them with support, minimise some of the issues that they've had.
Yes, I mean, I think I would say not just from families and their testimony, but also INQUEST's long-standing work with families and our overview of the investigation and INQUEST, and indeed more recently observations of fatal accident inquiries in Scotland. So it's a combination of that experience.
And INQUEST, as I understand it, are an organisation that has 40 years' experience of these matters. Is that true?
That's true, yes.
And can I ask you to confirm that the contents of this statement that we see on the screen are true, and you've endeavoured to be as accurate as possible in the contents that you provided for the chair? Absolutely.
Just one thing I've noticed is that this statement was signed in September 23, when I was still a member of the cross-government sponsored independent advisory panel on deaths in custody. And my third term of office on that panel concluded at the end of last year. So I am no longer on that, just for accuracy's sake.
I'll come on to that in a moment, but that was the position when it was signed.
Yes.
And can I confirm with you that you understand that this statement may form part of the evidence available to the chair to consider, and it will be published on the inquiry's website at the conclusion of your evidence?
Yes.
Can I look at your second statement, please? Now, the request was SBPI 00591, and that was sent to you. There we are. That's the questions that were sent. And then the actual second statement, if I can call it that, or the response to the Rule 8 request, is SPPI 00607. And you'll see that this is headed up Expert Witness Statement, Deborah Coles. And if we move down the page, it was taken by the inquiry team on the 25th and 30th of April this year. Do you recognise this statement?
Yeah.
And if we look at the last page, it's 65 pages long. And again, we have a redacted version, so your signature's not appearing on the screen, but you have a hard copy in the folder. And that was signed by you on the 23rd of May, 2024. And if we could look at the final paragraph, 177, this says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And you understood that to be the case when you signed it?
Yes.
Thank you. Can I turn to your work now with INQUEST, please? You've explained it's a charity. Please correct me if I'm wrong. Are INQUEST the only charity providing expertise on state-related deaths and their investigation to bereaved people, lawyers, advice and support agencies, the media and parliamentarians?
Yes.
So you're providing advice and support, if required, to those individuals or organisations?
Yes, so we have a casework team who work directly with families after deaths in custody and detention. So that includes police, prison, mental health settings, immigration settings, learning disability settings, as well as we're involved with some of the families who were bereaved after the Grenfell Tower fire. And so that's direct casework support. And then we also have, we do policy and campaigning work for change.
Right, thank you. Can we look at SBPI 00366? And this is your first statement. And if we could look at paragraphs 7, 8 and 9. Let's start with 7. And I think you gave us a summary of the work that INQUEST do. 7, we work with bereaved families from the outset, supporting them through post-death investigation processes. We coordinate a national network of over 400 lawyers called the INQUEST Lawyers Group, the ILG, who provides specialist legal representation for bereaved families. We hold regular roundtable meetings between ILG members and investigative bodies to inform discussions around best practice and raise issues of concern. This includes regular meetings with investigation bodies, and that includes the Prisons and Probation Ombudsman, the Independent Office of Police Conduct, and other relevant stakeholders, including His Majesty's Inspectorate of Prisons, the Chief Coroner and the Crown Prosecution Service. And is that part of what you described as your direct casework and support?
Yes, the direct casework and support, obviously, for bereaved families, but then the policy work we do involving the regular meetings with the
organisations. Thank you. And paragraph 8, if we can just move down the page. Our specialist casework service gives INQUEST a unique perspective on the operation of the post-death investigative system. This overview enables us to identify systemic issues arising from deaths and the way they are investigated, and understand how recommendations arising from individual deaths are followed up and changes made both at a local and national level. And we know that you're based in London and you
Yes.
do you work primarily in England and Wales?
Primarily, yes.
But you have had some experience of work or cases involving Scotland.
Yes.
And you've said this is a unique perspective. As at today's date, are you aware of any other charity that fulfills this role that INQUEST does?
No.
None. And paragraph 9, in addition, our focus on deaths in custody and detention means INQUEST holds knowledge on the operation of detention systems Our knowledge and experience is extensive, detailed, and evidence-based, going back 4 decades. INQUEST's policy work and casework situates deaths in their broader social and political context. For example, we have carried out thematic areas of work on deaths in women's prisons, deaths of children and young people, deaths of black and racialised people in prison and following police contact, deaths in immigration detention, and deaths in mental health settings. Our research shows that state-related deaths are not just isolated individual tragedies, but in part related to historic and systemic issues such as structural racism, discrimination, and other concerns such as inequality and poverty. I'm interested in this inquiry, we're primarily interested in the death of a black man, as you know, Mr. Bayo,
Yes.
who died on the 3rd of May 2015, and that was following police contact. You've talked here about thematic areas of work in relation to deaths of black people following police contact. Can you explain what you mean by thematic work?
Yes, I mean, I think one of the benefits of an organisation, not only going back 4 decades, but that has the day-to-day work with families, is that we are able to both look back and look at the present day. So that has enabled us to identify through our casework, our statistical monitoring, trends and patterns. And so from when I started in really doing this work in the early 90s, we were aware of a pattern of deaths of black people, particularly black men, who were dying after being restrained by police officers. And so that has always remained an organisational priority and has enabled us to conduct thematic work. And by that I mean using the evidence that we've gleaned from the investigations and primarily inquests in order to identify systemic issues that come out of those individual cases. And I think the important point there is the point that I make about the fact that, of course, for families, these are individual tragedies, but as an organisation, we're able to look at them in a broader context and show that they are systemic, that there is an ongoing pattern and a pattern that has been going back decades.
Thank you. And we'll come on to those patterns later today. Can I say, from reading this paragraph, is it fair to say that you work with families of those who have died who are of all races, or is it simply just black people?
Oh no, I mean absolutely. Our work cuts across race, gender, disability. I mean when you consider the nature of the work that we do, particularly on deaths in custody and detention, it affects all communities. But I think it's important probably to say that some of the concerns we have raise particular concerns about the treatment of people from particular communities. So the relevance of race, the relevance of class and gender is felt in our work and in the thematic areas that we've chosen to delve into more deeply.
Thank you. I think obviously our interest primarily is in relation to the death of a black man.
Yeah.
And so that will be against that context that
Absolutely.
I ask you questions today.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned a moment ago that you had been a member of the cross-government sponsored independent advisory panel for deaths in custody. That's quite a mouthful. Did I get that
indeed.
correct?
The IAP is.
Could you help me understand the work of that cross-party?
So this was a public appointment that had to be approved by the Secretary of State for Justice, of which there have been many in the period that I was on the IAP. But effectively, the role of that panel was to give advice to ministers particularly concerning, the prevention of deaths in custody. So that cut across deaths in police, prison, and mental health detention. And we were a panel that met regularly, carried out particular, pieces of research, would give evidence to conferences, and as part of that, there were a particular review. I mean, albeit this is about prison, but Lord Harris, who was one of the chairs of the IAP, conducted a review of deaths of children and young people in prison. So I was involved in that review. But effectively, it was to try and take forward some of the issues raised by deaths in custody. And the panel members were from a broad range of professions: pathologists, academics, lawyers, and myself. And so I think most relevant probably to this inquiry is that obviously deaths in police custody and following police contact was one of the thematic areas that the panel looked at. And
was that in your capacity as now the director of INQUEST?
Yeah, I mean, I was director of INQUEST, but it was a public appointment, so it was something I did as well as my.
So it was actually a public appointment of
Yes.
you as an individual.
Yes.
Now, I understand that in addition to the information you've given the chair in your statements, that you may also have a CV which provides more detail.
Yes, I have a CV which I can make available, absolutely.
I wondered if you would be willing to make that
Of
available
course.
to the chair.
Yeah.
Thank you very much. The inquiry team will be in touch with you in that regard. Now, as well as the cross-party work you've been telling us about, you've also mentioned the death in custody report by Lady Angelini,
Yeah.
as she now is, and you've told us about the listening days. I also noted in your statement, S607, at paragraph 57, that INQUEST have also worked in relation to matters that come before the United Nations.
Yeah.
And I think here you've talked about submissions that INQUEST have made to the UN on data in deaths in custody.
Mm-hmm.
And I think they're listed here in this paragraph. There's a submission on systemic racism in December 2020 in relation to independent expert mechanism to advance racial justice and equality. And that was in the context of law enforcement in May 2022, and the INQUEST submission to the United Nations Special Rapporteur on extrajudicial summary and arbitrary executions on the investigation, documentation and prevention of deaths in custody in the criminal justice context from March of last year. Can you tell us a little about these submissions?
Yes, and in fact, just looking at that, it reminds me, and I can't remember if it's in any of my statements, that previously we've also given evidence to the United Nations Third Committee, which is the Committee on the Elimination of Racial Discrimination, and that one of the early submissions we made was back in the early 90s, and it was particularly around the fact that there was no available data on deaths in police custody disaggregated by ethnicity, race and ethnicity. I mean, that's quite an old report, but it's relevant in this context. And we've had a long-standing period of engagement with the United Nations, and I've previously given evidence on concerns around deaths of black people in following police contact. And so we keep a watching brief on when they are doing various inquiries and reviews, and try where capacity allows to inform those reviews. And this section particularly refers to, I think, the question I was asked about data and the importance of good quality data.
Thank you. And although you've said the the submissions, the evidence you provided in the 90s was old in
Yeah.
relation to data. Is that something that you consider the chair might find useful?
Yes, I'll
Would you be
I'll
able to
dig that
provide us
out.
with that?
Yeah.
Thank you. Certainly, we've asked a number of witnesses questions about data
Yeah.
and issues with data, and it may be of interest to the chair to see what you were saying in the 90s. Can I move on then, please, and ask you about your prior involvement with the family?
Yes.
I think it's correct to say that in 2015, for the family of Mr. Bio, if they were seeking support or guidance of any description, there were two options. One, to instruct their own solicitor, but one who would be willing to give pro bono advice, because as I understand the position, there's no legal aid
Yeah.
provided. And the other would be to come to and make contact with INQUEST in London, because
Yeah.
at that stage there was no charity available in Scotland. And I think you've explained that was certainly the position in regard to other charities today. Does that remain the position today for families who are looking for support in a situation such as this for a bereaved family? Do those remain the two options, either to come to INQUEST or to seek a lawyer who would do it pro bono?
Yes, but it also, I suppose it also begs the question of whether or not those families have even been informed of their rights to seek legal representation. And I think that's one of my concerns, is that that complete gap in advice and support, in those very early days about what families' legal rights are in these processes. And certainly in Scotland, I'm very conscious that there is an absence of any organisation like ours. And to be perfectly honest, it's a question of luck as to whether or not families may find out about our organisation or not. A lot of families in the England and Wales context will just Google inquest because they might have been told that at some point there'll be an inquest, and of course we pop up. But that I think that's something that Lady Angelini made very clear in her report, that when something catastrophic happens that a family, of course, have never experienced before, the thing that they need is proper advice and support about what the processes are going to be. And it's not a question, as she very well put it, I think, in her review, it's not a question of tea and sympathy. It's about practical advice and information about your rights in the process and what is going to happen. So it's fair to say that at the moment it is really lacking in the Scottish jurisdiction, I think.
In England and Wales, is there a body or an organisation that is under an obligation to advise families in this situation that they can seek legal advice?
Did you say obligation?
Is there an organisation with an obligation to advise families along those lines?
Not an obligation, but I think best practice, it is assumed that those bodies who are conducting investigations should tell families what their rights in the process are. And now, I think, following a lot of work by families and by INQUEST, there are organisations who have leaflets that take them through the process, but also will give information on organisations that can help. So obviously INQUEST, as you've already said, is unique in the sense that's what we're there for, but also other bereavement organisations or organisations that might help with some of the post-death processes that families have to go through.
And are you aware of any organisation that has a not necessarily an obligation, given what you've said, but a practice of providing families in that situation with that advice in Scotland?
No, and I when I was doing my kind of scoping work, looking at the situation in Scotland, I conducted some desk research and found it extremely difficult to find out any information. And in fact, you just kind of, the delights of kind of Google searches is that you find yourself going from kind of website to website, but ending up nowhere. So I felt, and I think I addressed this in my first statement in terms of best practice, what I felt could be done to alleviate that information deficit, really, I'd call it.
Thank you. Sticking with the meetings you've had with the family, you have addressed this in both of your statements in some detail. Let's look at those for the moment. The first one, 366, if we look at paragraph 12. And you've explained that you were contacted by Amar Anwar's solicitor a few days after the death of Sheku Bayo, who was aware of my work at INQUEST on other restraint-related deaths following police contact. We have over 400 lawyers in our INQUEST lawyers group who benefit from our extensive resources and information. And Amar joined this network in 2015, and that was the year Mr. Bayo died.
Yes.
In the absence of any similar organisation in Scotland with expertise in this area, and with no funding available for legal representation, I supplied as much information and resources on restraint-related deaths and Article 2 investigations to assist the legal team.
Correct.
In the first instance, I advised on the importance of a second post-mortem and the expertise in this area of pathologist Nat Carey and Dr. Maurice Lipsitch. And we've had the benefit of both those gentlemen's evidence. And then at 13, you say, I attended several meetings with family members to share my experience and offer ongoing support through what I knew would be a protracted and complex legal process. I attended meetings with the family's counsel and shared a variety of resources to assist them in their background research. So was this a number of meetings where you met with the lawyers, the legal representatives, solicitor and counsel for the family? And was that part of the support that INQUEST give to families who are bereaved?
Yes, and I mean, I think in particular, Amar Anwar contacted me because he was aware of the fact that INQUEST had worked on, a series of restraint-related deaths previously, and I was very keen to share my advice and expertise at that early stage, particularly because I was conscious about the importance of trying to get the information and things done properly from the outset to avoid any potential problems moving forward, and certainly the issue of a second post-mortem. And ensuring that there was a pathologist with experience of conducting post-mortems into restraint-related deaths. I felt that that was really, really critical in those, in those early stages.
Thank you. And then do we see at paragraph 14 that you also mention attending a meeting with the PERC, the Lord Advocate, Frank Mulholland, the Crown Office, and James Wolfe, the second Lord Advocate involved, all of whom welcomed meeting me because of my knowledge in this area. It became clear to me that there were real concerns with the rigour and independence of the PERC investigation and the very limited scope of any subsequent fatal accident inquiry. I worked with the family and their legal team to develop arguments for why the seriousness and complexity of Sheku Bayo's death warranted a statutory public inquiry with a broad term of reference. This involved meetings with the then Justice Secretary Hamza Yusuf and First Minister Nicola Sturgeon. I've also shared my experience on restraint-related deaths and their broader context to public meetings and the media. So you refer to a number of meetings in this paragraph with a number of different individuals or organisations. And is this the type of support that you provide in INQUEST to families?
Yes, I mean, it's obviously all dependent on capacity and resources, but I was very conscious that this was an extremely important death that needed robust scrutiny. And given that I had started doing a wee bit of kind of scoping within Scotland, it felt important to put in that time and resource. But clearly, I mean, and I think it's important to say that, you know, I am based in London, and being the CEO of an organisation involves a lot of other work. So my involvement had to be balanced against the, you know, the demands of the organisation.
Now, I think you've mentioned scoping in Scotland, and you
Yes.
mentioned this in one of your statements. Could you explain to the Chair a little about that work that you're doing in Scotland?
Yeah, I mean, initially, INQUEST, and I was contacted by the Scottish Government, who were conducting a review of how deaths in mental health settings were investigated, and I was asked to come and give evidence. I believe it was the section, I think it's called the Section 37 review. I'm sure I'll be corrected. It's in my statement. And I became, and the Mental Welfare Commission were also at that time conducting some research and looking at how they, as the Commission, were working with families. And so I was invited to come up and, you know, share my expertise, you know, which I indeed did. And through that, I became more interested in how the investigation and FAI process worked. And around that time, not only was I contacted by Amar Anwar, we were also contacted by the family of Katie Allen, who was a 21-year-old young woman who died in Polmont Young Offender Institution, and she contacted INQUEST. So I was able to refer her to Amar Anwar. And so, you know, so from a kind of initial, you know, focus, I managed to get some funding to do some more scoping, looking at the different processes operating in Scotland, and in particular looking at families' experiences and also, you know, families' access to justice, which was how I was able to, you know, make my observations within my statements about, you know, the lack of any similar organisation, but also the difficulty that families have in trying to find out what their legal rights are, and their ability to properly, effectively participate in the processes that follow a death.
And you've mentioned funding. As a charity, does INQUEST rely on funding being provided?
Yes, we don't take any state funding because our independence is important. So we are funded entirely by trusts and foundations and also donations. That being said, obviously, you know, when I was appointed as the special advisor to Lady Ailish Angelini, I was paid, you know, from the review for my time and my expertise on that review. But we are a charity, and so we are funded entirely by trusts and foundations, and that is a challenging role because fundraising is not easy, not least at the moment.
Thank you. And then if we could move on to your second statement, 607, and if we could look at paragraph 3 first of all. I think you were referred to, we've heard evidence from Lindsay Miller, she's within Crown Office, and she mentioned 3 meetings in Crown Office between the Crown Office and Amar Anwar, at which you were present. That was July 2015, 15th October 2015 and October 2018. And does that accord with your memory of the meetings?
Yeah.
And then if we look at paragraph 14, and you provide some further detail about these meetings. I know there was a meeting I attended with Frank Mulholland.
Yeah.
When he was Lord Advocate. I thought that was an extremely productive and positive meeting. I distinctly remember being surprised and really welcoming the openness and seriousness with which the Lord Advocate listened to what we had to say. I had the opportunity to talk about my experience of similar deaths in England and Wales and was listened to really carefully. At that time, there were already real concerns about the way in which the investigation was being carried out. My understanding of the evidence we've heard at this inquiry is that at that time that Lord Mulholland was Lord Advocate, the investigation was being carried out by PERC. Does that accord with
Yes.
your recollection?
Yes.
My recollection is that there was a commitment from him, Frank Mulholland, to ensure that this was a very far-reaching inquiry. The very fact that we had an audience with the Lord Advocate at such an early stage, to me, gave me quite a lot of confidence and made me feel quite reassured that somebody of such legal seniority was taking on what we all had to say with seriousness. The very fact that he met with the family, that was extremely important and good practice. And I'm interested in your comment about how positive, you describe this meeting in a positive way, and you describe it as extremely important and good practice.
Yeah.
Can you help the chair understand how this very positive approach, what impact that had on the family at the time?
I mean, I think the family felt listened to. I felt that they had trust and confidence in his commitment as Lord Advocate to ensuring that this was a robust and, you know, far-reaching inquiry. And I certainly felt that as well. You know, I recall we sat around the table and we were given, you know, enough time to actually talk through what all the different concerns were. I felt that I was treated with real respect about, you know, my experience, that I was listened to. And I think we all came away thinking, well, you know, this made us all feel that perhaps there was going to be the investigation that such a serious death warranted.
And you've talked about being aware of concerns, you describe them as already real concerns.
Yes.
About the PERC investigation, but you've also said the family maintained trust and confidence in the process itself.
Well, I think Frank Mulholland was extremely open and listened really carefully and gave the family a real opportunity to talk through what their concerns were. And, you know, for somebody that, you know, was coming from the England and Wales jurisdiction, to have an audience with the Lord Advocate, for me, felt extremely positive, and gave us all reassurance. But sadly, that was not then subsequently met.
Can we look at the next paragraph where you describe the change? I'm asked if I have any further comments to make about the meetings I attended with the Crown Office or Lord's Advocate. Much later down the line, on the 23rd of October 2018, my notes say I was at a follow-up meeting with the next Lord Advocate, James Wolfe, and the family and their lawyers. My role in these meetings would always be to listen, but also to add my thoughts where I felt I had something useful to say. It was my expertise and understanding of investigations into these deaths over 3 decades that added value to those meetings, because I could compare my experience of similar deaths and how investigations were carried out to encourage best practice and to try to avoid a repeat of investigations that I've been involved in that have gone wrong. There was enough good practice to be able to help inform the approach that the relevant authorities were taking. As the meetings went along, it was becoming increasingly clear that this was not going to be the robust independent investigation that we had hoped for, and was committed to following the meeting with the previous Lord Advocate, Frank Mulholland. And I'm interested in the final passage of this paragraph at 15. It became increasingly clear that this was not going to be the robust independent investigation that we had hoped for. Can you explain to the chair why there was this change? What happened?
I mean, I think from recollection, there was certainly a lot of defensiveness from the PERC and from the Crown Office in response to the concerns that were being raised. I had said very early on at one of the first PERC meetings the importance of ensuring that there was, a proper pathologist with expertise appointed, and was then extremely concerned to hear that the instruction had been to Stephen Karsh, and I was very clear in, what I said about that, and I had already explained that we had concerns about his approach to restraint-related deaths, particularly about he as a proponent of excited delirium. There was also, I think, I was told that I should, when I was raising concerns, I was told that I should be reassured that the PERC were taking advice from what was then the Independent Police Complaints Commission, now the IOPC. And to be frank, that didn't reassure, but rather concern me, because we had at that time ongoing discussions, both as INQUEST but also with our INQUEST lawyers group, about concerns with the way in which the IPCC were conducting investigations at that time. And what I had always tried to do in any of these meetings was to try and use my experience to help avoid the mistakes that I had seen from previous cases in the past. That was my role, I mean, to be clear, I'm not a lawyer, but I do have considerable experience in these investigations going back many, many years. So I was there to try and just assist, and I believe I was professional in doing that. But I think increasingly what I felt was that the legitimate concerns that were being raised by the family, by their lawyer, and by myself were just met with a lack of interest, a lack of seriousness, and a lot of defensiveness. And I think that characterised my experience moving forward, which was in such sharp contrast to what we had experienced with, Frank Mulholland. I mean, I have to, that was such a good meeting, and it did inspire confidence. And so therefore there was a real disconnect between that and the kind of aspirations that he had for the investigation, and then what subsequently followed. And of course it was then not helped by some of the kind of misinformation that was then appearing in the media.
You've described how the differences in the way the meetings were handled between Frank Mulholland and James Wolfe had an impact. Yeah. Looking back now, can you think of any ways where that second meeting, or the meeting you had with James Wolfe, could have been better handled to maintain what had been a very positive approach at the outset?
I mean, I think by that time, I mean, if I'm recalling the right meeting, if I kind of remember correctly, there was just so much evidence that robust investigation that we had all hoped was simply not happening. And I would say if we'd all been listened to, and I think if expertise had been sought from the right people, and I think it's fair to say that the PERC were given ample information about who they could consult with, who they could instruct. I think had they approached the meeting, I mean, for example, at one of the meetings, I was told, the fatal accident inquiry, that'll be the opportunity to find out more, or to explore these areas in more detail. And that to me suggested that they had already decided that this was not going to be an investigation that resulted in any criminal prosecution. It was almost that the decision had been made that this would be an investigation, and then it would end up being a fatal accident inquiry. And I think that demonstrated to me almost that conceptions about the fact that this was an investigation that was going to be carried out and then it would end up in a fatal accident inquiry. And that kind of institutional unwillingness to consider whether or not the evidence that they were going to find out would result in potential wrongdoing or criminality by police officers. And I'm afraid to say that was exactly some of the challenges that we were having at the time with the IPCC, in terms of that unwillingness to robustly explore and investigate properly.
At the time you met with James Wolfe, the then Lord Advocate, was that when the investigation was still ongoing? Because I know you mentioned one date, but we've heard evidence that was after the no pro decision had been taken.
Yeah.
I'm just wondering if you could perhaps be mistaken about that date.
Maybe it was the second of those meetings.
So at the time you met with James Wolfe, was the investigation still ongoing?
Still ongoing the first time, yeah.
Now, you mentioned if they'd taken advice from the right people. Who would the right people have been?
Well, I mean, I said I believe that at the first meeting, I talked about the importance of the post-mortem medical evidence. So I specifically mentioned Nat Carey and Maurice Lipsitch because we had worked with them previously, and I knew that they had a particular understanding and expertise in restraint-related deaths. Likewise, we had such a wealth of information about inquests and investigations that I was able to talk about individual cases and also direct them to available information. But as I say, the impression that I was given was that they had already set in mind the direction they were going. They were seeking advice from the IPCC, and then they instructed Stephen Karsh. And I did express my concerns. I also talked about, of course, the importance of Article 2, the right to life, and how it was absolutely vital that Sheku's family were able to effectively participate in the investigation. And that's not just a question, as I said before, this isn't about being nice to a family, it's about their legal rights to play a meaningful part and to have their concerns addressed.
Thank you. Now, you've mentioned Stephen Karch
Yes.
a couple of times today, and we have heard evidence in relation to Mr. Karch, and we have an inquiry statement from him. I'm interested in when you expressed your concerns about Stephen Karch to Crown Office. Do you remember? Was it at the first meeting or at subsequent meetings?
I believe it was with I don't think it was the Crown Office, I think it was the PERC. It was the meeting with the PERC. I mean, I'll stand to be corrected. This is a few years ago, but I'm pretty sure it was with the meeting with Lindsay Miller and the. Is that right? Would that be right?
Lindsay Miller is from Crown Office, and we've heard that there was a meeting with Kate Frame, who was then the Commissioner, and with her investigators.
Yeah.
But there were other meetings with Crown Office also. We've heard that concerns were raised about Dr. Karch.
Yes.
But if you don't remember,
I don't remember which of those meetings, but I certainly remember raising them.
All right, thank you. Let's have a look at paragraph 16, please. If we can bring that up. I'm asked how this was becoming clear. It was becoming clear from my work alongside Amar Anwar with the family, and then the discussions that were coming out of the meetings. There was a lot of defensiveness from the PERC and the Crown Office in response to legitimate concerns being raised. Without meaning to be disrespectful, it felt quite shambolic and rather inexperienced, in the sense of not taking on board some of the concerns that were being raised. It didn't feel that it was an investigation that was being led to uncover the truth. It felt more like an investigation that was trying to deny the concerns that the families and their lawyers were raising about the circumstances in which Sheku died. That was also not assisted by the role of the Police Federation and the misinformation that was appearing in the media. I thought it was absolutely reprehensible that the pathologist who'd been instructed, Karch, then did an interview with a newspaper about alleged drug use. I believe this to be such unprofessional behaviour from somebody who's supposed to be an independent expert, and a clear attempt to create a narrative about the death that excluded restraint. There appeared to be press briefings of selective material designed to demonise Sheku out into the public domain, relating to information about alleged drug use. This is a familiar pattern we have seen over decades, wherein the state orchestrates narratives centring on the supposed criminality and violence of the deceased. In this case, the expert was implying drugs were the primary issue in Sheku's death. It was also interesting to note that the Police Federation drew attention to deaths in England and Wales, where an inquest or coroner made reference to ED, excited delirium, and ABD, acute behavioural disorder, but not to the cleric concerns many of these inquests revealed in relation to the dangers of restraint. The combination of all the other things that were happening just didn't really inspire trust and confidence. So you've talked, that's a big paragraph. I'd like to go through some of those elements with you. And you've talked about how the context, the situation did not inspire trust and confidence. If we could look through this, you talk about, if we can go back to the top, please. You said it felt shambolic and rather inexperienced. Is that in connection with meeting with PERC or Crown Office or both?
I mean, I think initially it was with the PERC, and you know, not forgetting, of course, that we also, you know, had the context of the way in which Sheku's family and friends had been treated from the outset as potential suspects, and I think what it felt like to me was that the legitimate concerns that were being raised by the family and their lawyers and myself were just being dismissed. They weren't being heard, and I think increasingly, you know, the family started to, you know, very quickly lose trust in you know, the investigation process.
When you mention the word suspects, can you explain what you mean by that?
Well, I think, I mean, I believe, and obviously I'm at a disadvantage in the sense of not being able to hear all the evidence from you know, the inquiry, but the fact that, you know, the family had heard about the death of their loved one in the most appalling circumstances, but then the way in which Colette, his partner at the time, was treated, the difficulty the family had in establishing what had happened, the way in which some of his friends were treated. You know, this is a grieving family, and the worst thing has happened to them. And so to have that experience very early on is bad enough. But then to then not, you know, have their concerns listened to and almost begin that kind of almost that fight to try and find out, you know, what happened and to get the investigation to do the job that it should do, not just in the family's interest, but in the public interest. That's why we have an independent investigation process for these deaths. And so, you know, and obviously we knew from the outset that Sheku had died whilst being restrained by police officers. And so that was particularly important that was most rigorously looked into, because, you know, I knew from previous deaths in very similar circumstances that all too often the significance of the restraint and the contribution of the restraint to the death can be, you know, too often overlooked. And, you know, you've brought up the issue of excited delirium or acute behavioural disturbance, and, you know, the focus on ED as some kind of, you know, diagnosis that's used to try and, in a way, deflect attention away from restraint. That was concerning. And what I was trying to do is say to the PERT, you know, don't fall into that trap. Make sure you rigorously investigate and use the experts who've got experience in all of this to do so.
Thank you. And then your response at 16 goes on to say, this was also not assisted by the role of the Police Federation and the misinformation that was appearing in the media. I wonder if you could expand on that.
Well, I think what I saw was an attempt to present the police as peripheral to what happened, and you know the information that came out into the newspaper from Stephen Karsh, I think, was quite a good example of what I was concerned about and what I'd seen over a number of previous cases where information is put into the public domain about the alleged drug use of the person who's died in a way to deflect and deny the contribution that restraint may have played, but also that attempt to try and demonize and blame the individual for their own death, and for that information to be put out into a newspaper by somebody who was a professional. I mean, that's absolutely reprehensible conduct, and I've seen it in previous cases, and it's, in a way, I think it's what I say about alarm bells ringing to me about the way in which this investigation was being conducted, and you know that's a very good example of that, and I think I also the other issue that was kind of happening alongside that was the concentration was on the purported violence of Sheku on alleged drug use, rather than on how he died, and the fact that he had died following an encounter with the police and following restraint by a number of police officers. And
you've talked this morning about thematic work and
Yes.
the work of INQUEST over 40 years and your own involvement for over 30 years. Were these parallels that you felt were beginning to emerge from your understanding of the investigation into Mr. Bio's death?
Yes, and it was also what I was trying to ensure didn't happen. Hence my involvement. I was very privileged to meet the family at a very early stage, and their lawyer. And one of the things I was very keen to try and avoid was making mistakes that I had seen being made in the England and Wales jurisdiction. And the fact that we're sitting here 9 years on from Sheku's death in a public inquiry kind of really, I suppose, reiterates that point, which is precisely what we were trying to avoid.
And can we just go back up to go to the bottom of that, and this, where you talk here about the state orchestrates narratives centering on the supposed criminality and violence of the deceased. Is that really a summary of what you've just been?
Yes, and I think particularly where the person who died is from a black community. That's where we very much see those kind of racialized constructions that equate black men with criminality and dangerousness. I was very disappointed, but particularly upset for the family, because it's really difficult to put across what it's like for a family to go through these processes, but then to see the attempts to kind of demonize and dehumanize the person that they loved, who has died. I know from my conversations how painful that has been, and it shouldn't have. It should not have happened.
Thank you. We heard evidence from a Les Brown, who's a member of Crown Office staff. At that time, he was the head of criminal allegations against the police, and he worked in that department. And his recollection was that you also spoke about the disproportionate police use of force against black men, when you were at a meeting with Crown Office. Would you recollect that as
Yeah,
correct?
absolutely. Yeah.
And he also recalled you raising the idea of consideration of racial tropes and stereotypes of police officers dealing with black men.
Yes.
Would you have discussed that as well?
I would absolutely have discussed that, yes.
Right, thank you. And he recalled you talking about excited delirium and that being a racial issue of itself.
Yes,
So his recollection about those topics is correct.
it is.
Thank you. Now, I simply want to ask you, you've obviously had involvement with the family of Mr. Bio, and I wonder, reflecting now as you sit here, what impact, if any, this prior involvement with the family, you've said you respect the family, your prior involvement with them, what impact has that had on your ability to give evidence to this inquiry and to assist the chair in an independent or objective way about your experiences with INQUEST and the data that is available to INQUEST about over 40 years, about families and their experiences?
I mean, I think in my role as director, I navigate lots of different arenas. You know, on a day-to-day basis, I can be giving evidence to a parliamentary inquiry or committee. I can be meeting with a chief coroner or a minister, and I can be in the afternoon sitting down with a family. And I'm a professional. I have, you know, it has been my lifetime career. And I think I have that ability to be independent. You know, I say what I think, and I'm uncompromising in that. But my evidence and all the work I have done is evidence-based. It is based on those years of working alongside bereaved families, but also you know, through the investigations, through INQUEST, through government commissioned reviews, you know. And the very fact, I mean, I think there's no better illustration than probably my independence and professionalism than to be appointed as a special advisor by the former Home Secretary and Prime Minister Theresa May. And I don't think that would have happened if there'd been any question about my ability to be independent and, you know, give advice and evidence based on my long-term career.
Thank you. If there was anything during the course of your evidence today, if at any stage you feel your prior involvement with the family may be impacting on some of your evidence, would you please just let us know and draw that to the chair's attention?
Of course.
Thank you. Now, I'd like to move on. Can we look at paragraph 82, please? I think it's of the second statement. Yes, 607. And it says here, this is why it's important to talk about racism, because it's about how these perceptions manifest in police culture and practice, which means that they see a black man who may well be exhibiting bizarre behaviour or may well be in a mental health crisis. That can be because of mental ill health. It can be as a result of drugs, but they are in crisis. Rather than recognising that that person needs care and protection because they're particularly vulnerable, the default is they will go in and use force against that individual to contain, to gain compliance and control, rather than recognising this as a medical emergency. Now, this is an example of part of your statement, but do you consider INQUEST in any way to be anti-police or against the police in general?
No, I mean, I'm clearly concerned about when police abuse their powers or where they use excessive or an unreasonable force. And I do think as well that there are questions, broader questions than this inquiry is looking at, about the use of police in situations that may well require a different response. And I use mental health is a very good example. I think the police should not be first responders to people in mental health crisis. And indeed, I've talked to a lot of police officers who completely agree with me. No, I mean, I, as I said from the outset, the work that we do is evidence-based. And so the recommendations that we have developed over the years is informed by that evidence, that work with families, that overview of seeing a pattern of deaths that cause concern.
And as a charity, as an organisation, do INQUEST wish to work with the police to improve matters?
I think our objective as a charity is to try and prevent deaths happening. And so one of the reasons why we are on, for example, I sit as INQUEST on the Ministerial Board on Deaths in Custody, which is a group that brings together representatives from a whole range of different public bodies, including the police, is to share our knowledge and expertise in the hope that we will ensure the learning and the change to stop deaths happening. And that's our primary objective, is about learning, accountability and prevention.
Thank you. Can I ask you to look at another document now, please, WIT 87. And you'll see that this is headed Inquest Evidence Submission to the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. Report on systemic racism, violations of international human rights law against Africans and people of African descent by law enforcement agencies, especially those incidents that resulted in the death of George Floyd and other Africans and people of African descent, to contribute to accountability and redress for victims. Now, I think George Floyd died in the May of that year.
Yes.
And this is from the December of that year.
Yes.
And this is the month following the official commencement of this inquiry. So for your information, we were in the process of beginning the process of gathering in documents, but no evidence had been started at that stage. Can we look, please, at paragraph 19 of this document? And here there's a specific mention to Mr. Bayo.
Yes.
He died aged 31 following restraint by 5 police officers in May 2015 in Kirkcaldy, Scotland. He was stopped by police after they received a call about a man behaving unusually. Within 46 seconds of the arrival of the first 2 officers, he was held face down on the ground. During the restraint, officers used CS and Pava spray, Batten's leg and ankle restraints and handcuffs, and he was held face down. It's also alleged that 2 of the police officers involved and placed their full body weight on his upper body. He was unconscious within minutes of the restraint being applied and was pronounced dead at the hospital an hour and a half later. A post-mortem revealed that he sustained facial injuries, bruises to his body and a fracture to his rib. 4.5 years after his death, and as a result of concerns about the investigation of his death, the Scottish Government announced a public inquiry into his death, which is ongoing. So there's specific mention of Mr. Bayo there. Now, it may be suggested that there are errors contained within this paragraph. And the question of fact, the chair's heard all the evidence and it will be a matter for the chair. But it may be suggested that it was not correct to say that during the restraint, officers used CS and Pava spray, as one example, that it was used prior to the restraint. There may be a suggestion that to use the phrase that the police received a call about a man behaving unusually is not a fair reflection of the evidence that this inquiry has heard, that members of the public made a number of 999 calls. They were alarmed that Mr. Bio was holding a knife at that time. And I'm interested in this paragraph and the question of what is the source of information for INQUEST. So in December 2020, when this document is prepared and you're providing information about the death of Mr. Bio, and some of the information contained in here is correct, and isn't in any dispute. We know he did die aged 31. And I'm interested in the source of information that you have at a time when no evidence has been led in front of any criminal proceedings, inquests, inquiries, civil proceedings. No witness has been sworn in. Can you help us understand the background to how you prepare these things?
So the information that we would put in here would be based on information that we will have gathered from media reporting, from knowledge that we may have of the case. But obviously with Sheku Bio, there was a lot of information out there. And of course, at that point, none of it had been tested. And as you say, the inquiry hadn't started. So what we tried to do there is give an overview, but clearly without the benefit of the evidence being tested and the inquiry being set up. It's based primarily on media accounts and knowledge that we had about the case.
And where would that knowledge of the case come from?
I mean, from recollection, when this document was being drawn up in 2020, that would largely be, I mean, I would have had some of the meetings with the PERT, but obviously I'm also, quite careful about issues around confidentiality, and, it's quite important before, an inquest or before an inquiry that, you don't make direct comments on, what has actually caused a death. And so I think the way in which we've written this is to try and give an overview, but clearly not come to any concrete conclusion as to, how he died and what actually happened.
And is there a mechanism in INQUEST where you can verify information that you've gathered from accounts and media reporting and knowledge of the case?
I mean, largely it would be through also talking to the lawyer involved in an individual case as well. So it would be a combination of things, because obviously media coverage cannot be always relied upon.
Right, thank you. And if information was subsequently found to be incorrect, for example, if INQUEST became aware at some stage that things that had been said previously were wrong, would there be an attempt to correct that information if an opportunity arose? Yes, and also, I mean, I think it's also worth saying that the United Nations, when you put in submissions to the UN, they also, where you talk about individual cases, they also make representations to the UK government. So, they have, in a way, their own way of kind of verifying and checking up on information, because they ask questions. So that would be the same for Scottish Government in Sheku's case, but also the other cases that we've put in there as well. Right. And there's just one last thing I'd like to deal with, and that relates to SPPI 00513. And we will come back to this later today, but this is a document prepared by INQUEST called I Can't Breathe, Race, Death and British Policing, and this is the full report. Yep. And there's an introduction on page 12 of the PDF, which we can see. If we, I believe this was written by you, is that correct? No, it's written by somebody we employed to do the research, I see.
Reka Bazard.
Thank you. And that's a member of staff in INQUEST?
Yes, she was employed to do this research and bring this document together.
All right, thank you. And if we can move up the page, please. And you see there, it says background.
Yeah.
And it mentions in 2020 the image of George Floyd, a 46-year-old unarmed black man in Minneapolis, resonated with many of the bereaved families INQUEST has worked with. "I can't breathe" have been the dying words of several black people restrained by officers in broad daylight on British streets years before George Floyd reverberated around the world. And among them are, and a list of names are mentioned, and one of them is Sheku Bayo, who died after being restrained by Police Scotland officers in Kirkcaldy in 2015.
Yes.
And again, can I ask you, what was the source of information that you had, or your member of staff had, if you're aware, that those words were expressed by Mr. Bayo?
From the family, their crowd justice document, I can't remember what you call it, the website, I mean, talking to the family, but also, again, a couple of interviews that were in the newspaper quite soon after Sheku had died.
And if subsequently it became clear that there was no evidence that those words were expressed by Mr. Bayo, is that something, if you had an opportunity, that you would endeavour to correct?
Yes, I mean, I think I would also say that, you know, the title of the report and I Can't Breathe specifically really was an opportunity to try and make or raise greater awareness about the pattern of deaths that I talked previously about, where people have been, particularly black people, have been restrained to the point of death, and that quite often the struggle against the restraint is because they can't breathe. And I think I Can't Breathe obviously has taken on, I suppose, a more powerful and symbolic meaning more generally following those, you know, shocking images of George Floyd being killed. But what we wanted to try and demonstrate with this report is that there were a disturbing pattern of restraint-related deaths where people had died because they could not breathe.
And if you had known that, or become aware, if it was decided that Mr. Bayo did not utter those words, would you simply have removed his reference from this paragraph, but continued to include George Floyd, Kevin Clark, and Senny Lewis?
Yeah.
And George Floyd, Kevin Clark, and Senny Lewis, were you satisfied that those were words that they spoke?
Yes, and there were other names we could have put in there, and I take full responsibility for putting in Sheku Bayo's name. I mean, I would add, because I was keen to demonstrate that this was a UK problem. But your point is, yeah, I hear your point, and yes.
But there are other names that could have substituted for Mr. Bayo. Now, I'm conscious of the time, and I want to move on now, if I may.
Well, we'll take a 20-minute break.
Thank you.
Ms. Graham.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to deal with another topic, but to return to a document we've already looked at. WIT 87, please. And this was the INQUEST submission to the UN in December 2020. And I'd like to look at paragraph 10, please. Through an analysis of our casework, INQUEST has identified that the racial stereotype of big, black and dangerous, violent and volatile, when woven into the culture and practice of the police, has become a reoccurring feature, deaths following use of force and restraint by police in the UK. So I think that should be a reoccurring feature in deaths following. In cases where people have had mental health needs, additional negative imagery and stereotyping, mad, bad and dangerous, has informed their treatment. We are particularly concerned about the double discrimination experienced by black people with mental health issues. And we've heard from a Professor Meir in the inquiry who talked about intersectionality, where people with perhaps more than one protected characteristic can find that the discrimination is enhanced because of that intersectionality.
Absolutely.
Can we look at two examples that you give in this submission? Paragraph 12, first of all, and this relates to mental ill health and restraint, and the person mentioned is Sean Rigg, who was 40 years old. And I'll read this out in a moment, but did INQUEST have direct experience in relation to the death of Mr. Rigg?
Yes, we worked with the family from the outset, and indeed, Marcia Rigg, Sean's sister, is on our family reference group and is also one of our members of our Board of Trustees.
And we hope to hear from Marcia Rigg later in the hearing. I'll read this out and then I'll ask you some further questions. So Sean Rigg, 40, died of a cardiac arrest following an 8-minute prone restraint by Metropolitan Police officers in 2008 when he was experiencing a mental health crisis. In 2012, the INQUEST jury found that his death was contributed to by a litany of failures, including that the police failed to identify that Sean was a vulnerable person at the point of arrest and take him to an accident and emergency department rather than a police station. An officer involved in Sean's arrest was captured at the custody desk saying, "I hope he hasn't got anything, I've got his blood on me and he's faking it." When Sean was eventually carried out of the van, he was shown to be slumped and unresponsive. In this case, as in others, a racialised fixation on dangerousness by law enforcement personnel meant they failed to consider his welfare and safety. A jury at his inquest concluded, whilst in custody, the police failed to uphold Sean's basic rights and omitted to deliver the appropriate care, and that restraint in the prone position was unnecessary and unsuitable. I'd like to go through some elements of this paragraph with you, if I may. You've talked about how Mr. Rigg was experiencing a mental health crisis, and you say the police failed to identify that Sean was a vulnerable person at point of arrest and take him to an A&E department rather than a police station. I'm interested in that as a theme, that there's a failure to recognise a medical emergency. Could you tell us more about that?
I mean, I think in in this context, Sean was known to be vulnerable and was certainly in a mental health crisis at the time. And one of the things that we've noticed in our monitoring work and obviously our case work is that rather than officers stepping back and containing and de-escalating a situation, we see that default to the immediate use of force. And of course, on somebody who is in a mental health crisis, now that can be because of mental ill health. It can also be because somebody's intoxicated, be that with drugs or alcohol, and so can be extremely confused and agitated. And the use of restraint, and in particular, the restraint until somebody is subdued and stops struggling, is ultimately the point at which, in many cases, somebody is going is dying or is indeed dead. And I think with Sean's case, one of the concerns that we had amongst many was the fact that the excessive prone restraint that he was subjected to, culminating in his ultimate death.
In the experience of INQUEST, we've heard evidence that Sean Rigg was a black man.
Yes.
And in the experience of INQUEST, is there a disproportionality that's been identified about how a white man in mental health crisis is treated compared to a black man in mental health crisis?
I think what our monitoring has shown is that with black men in particular, it's the point I made earlier about equating black men with dangerousness, with violence, with superhuman strength. I mean, some of the language that you hear, but then when you also consider some of the tropes around mental health and that kind of idea of mad, bad, and dangerousness, if you've got the intersection of both of those, then that can be fatal. And we mention other examples. And I mean, I think it's important to say that there have been deaths of white people, and I'm thinking the death of, for example, James Herbert, who was restrained by police officers, culminated in a significant report by the IPCC called 6 Mischances, which was about treating people with mental health as a medical emergency. And obviously Sean's case, like that of Olusheni Lewis, they were the two quite significant cases that led to the setting up of the Angelini Review.
Right. And from the experience of INQUEST, is there a difference noted? You've mentioned containment and de-escalation.
Yeah.
Have INQUEST noted a difference between the speed at which officers resort to use of force in relation to a black man in mental health crisis compared to a white man?
Yes, I mean, there's particular, in our various reports, what we have identified is the immediacy of the default to use of force, and that's, in terms of Sheku, it's one of the things that concerned me when I first learned of Sheku's death was, what I was told about the very short time from which the police arrived and to the point that he was restrained, and that is definitely a pattern that we have seen and continue to see in our casework.
And is that a pattern that you see in relation to black men as opposed to white men?
Yes.
Thank you. And then you've mentioned Olusheni Lewis, or Sheni Lewis.
Yeah.
If we look at paragraph 13, again, was this an incident that INQUEST had direct experience?
Yes, we
with?
worked with the family and their lawyer.
Thank you. Olusheni Lewis, 23, died in 2010, a mental health unit where he was a voluntary patient. Multiple failures at multiple levels meant hospital staff called on the assistance of the police when Sheni became unwell. His death followed 2 successive periods of prolonged restraint by 11 Metropolitan Police officers. At the inquest into his death in 2017, the jury found that the use of restraint, which included the use of mechanical restraints, was found to have been excessive, unreasonable, unnecessary, disproportionate, and contributed to his death. The jury concluded that there was a failure on part of the hospital staff and police officers alike to provide basic life support when he collapsed under restraint. racist and dehumanising stereotypes were employed by police officers to defend their actions during the inquest. We didn't immediately call a doctor when he became unresponsive because we weren't 100% sure if he was definitely unconscious or not breathing. We left the room in case he was feigning, passing out as a ploy to escape. So again, a number of issues emerged from this paragraph. You've identified that the police became involved and carried out a prolonged restraint, which you've mentioned. And this was described as excessive by the jury, the inquest jury. The failure on the part of hospital staff and police alike to provide basic life support when he collapsed under restraint. Again, from the experiences that INQUEST have, is this a theme that you see, a pattern that you see?
Yeah. I mean, I think in particular, this suggestion that somebody is faking unconsciousness, faking it, despite the fact that clearly they're in a critical point of death or indeed dying. And that's a pattern that we've monitored, sadly, for a very long time and continue to monitor. And that, I have to say, doesn't just, it's not just in the context of police-related deaths, it's also in the context of prison and mental health. And I mean, you've already said that the shocking aspect of this is that Shaney was actually in a mental health setting when, somewhere where one would expect, his family certainly expected that he would be safe, and he was subjected to that prolonged and dangerous restraint.
And have INQUEST noted a difference in the way white men are treated compared to black men in this type of situation?
I think particularly about the stereotypes that I've referred to, the racist and dehumanising stereotypes that we've seen. And that goes, that also comes out at at INQUEST, where there's language used about people being, impervious to pain, and animalistic kind of noises being made. I mean, I've alluded to some of them in my statement, but I think the issue around just that culture of kind of disbelief when somebody's going into crisis, who's dying, is that feigning it, faking it, is something that we hear too often.
Right. And in relation to racist and dehumanising stereotypes, this is mentioned in the submission. Mm-hmm. You've also mentioned this aspect in your statement. I think in 607 at 71, we can put that on the screen. And I think at paragraph 71, you do talk about the themes emerging, and you mention Olashani, Lewis, Sean Riggs, and you also mention a case of Mark Duggan.
Yeah.
You say at 71, I'm asked whether I can speak from my experience with families bereaved by state-related deaths about any common themes relating to interactions between black men and the police. You talk about the 40-year history INQUEST has. When we've looked at these issues, we situate police killings or deaths following the use of restraint on black people within that broader and longer history of police contact and harassment. These, by their very nature, have been and continue to be the most controversial, and their consequent impact on police and community relations has been profound. These deaths connect with the black community's experience of structural racism and the discriminatory over-policing and criminalisation. They have been the catalyst for considerable public anger and community-based disturbances in response to what is perceived as pervasive state violence with impunity. And I've mentioned around the disproportionate stop and search, use of force, and how that then makes death more likely. Mm-hmm. I'm interested in asking you, first of all, about the impact on the public and on the community in a wider context of these incidents.
I mean, I think that there is no doubt that, a number of a number of deaths, and as I say, obviously we're talking over decades, have taken place in black communities that have had experiences of over-policing and have also had experience of high-profile deaths in custody. And, you know, not only do you have to understand, you know, the community trauma alongside, you know, the family trauma of, you know, a death following contact with police officers, but then the way in which you see how these deaths take, you know, many years very often before there's any conclusion. I've talked already about the kind of misinformation, that kind of culture of delay and denial and defensiveness. But also many, you know, many of these deaths raise, you know, really disturbing evidence about how somebody has been treated, and about, you know, extreme violence used against them. But then to see the fact that nobody is ever held to account, either at an individual or at a senior management level, for what's happened, then that creates, you know, real community anger and mistrust of the very agencies that you look to ensure that, you know, people are held accountable and that there is change. And, you know, sadly, and I think most frustratingly from my perspective, is that, you know, we've just seen death after death raising the same issues of concern, and yet those deaths keep happening.
And I was going to come on and ask you about the impact on the families and the family. You've described it as family trauma in your evidence. And is that really a description of the experience of families in this situation?
I mean, I don't think there's any other way to describe it. I mean, it is a traumatic bereavement in that it's unexpected. It involves the state, and then you effectively have the state controlling everything that follows the investigation. The body is in effect belongs to the state, and then families, you know, in a way, families grieving. It has to be put on hold while they try and navigate the various legal processes that follow. And, you know, what families tell us time and time again is, firstly, of course, they want the truth about what's happened, and they want, you know, if there's wrongdoing or criminality, they want, you know, people held to account. But most of all, they want it to stop happening to somebody else. And one of the things that I don't think is understood is the added trauma for families that we work with who've looked to these processes for change to then hear about another death in similar circumstances. So for a bereaved family, there is not just the trauma of the individual death, but the very processes that they have to engage with can be re-traumatizing before they have a kind of conclusion that, you know, hopefully means that they can then begin to start grieving. But, you know, there's also a really shocking lack of kind of bereavement counselling support available to families. I think there's a lack of understanding from some bereavement, organisations about the additional trauma where you have a death that involves protracted investigations. And, you know, I think that families are very often just, you know, quite isolated, left to effectively, you know, get on with it. And as I said, you know, this morning in relation to Sheku Baya's family, you know, I think people forget that this places a huge emotional and physical toll on families, you know, whose lives are effectively put on hold whilst the various legal processes do their job.
Can we move on, please, to the same statement, paragraph 78? And this follows up on what you were saying a moment ago about faking it. Another theme that's come out of some of our work on deaths of black people has been when officers are asked, why did you continue restraining somebody when they effectively stopped breathing or they're dead? The amount of times you hear reference by a police officer to someone feigning unconsciousness or faking it, and the culture of disbelief and disregard to health and being of the person in a state of collapse, death or near death. Further evidence of the criminalisation and dehumanisation of the deceased to justify police violence and blame the victim for the violence and neglect the experience. Can I ask you about, we've talked about death.
Yeah.
Can I ask you about any themes that have emerged in INQUEST's work that identify failures or delay in providing first aid to a person who is in that situation?
I mean, I would suggest that that probably characterises quite a lot of the deaths that we are involved with, and then failure to recognise that the situation is effectively a medical emergency. I mean, I think that's something that's come out of training, maybe, you know, much more recently. In fact, around the time of the Angelini review. But I think one of the concerns that I have around restraint-related deaths is I think it's people are well aware of the potential dangers that restraint can bring, particularly prone restraint. And one of the things that I have seen in a lot of these cases is where police officers appear to have kind of lost sight of the person as a human being, and that lack of recognition that the struggle against restraint, which they perceive as violence, and quite often results in even more force. That struggling is often born, out of fear, out of distress, but significantly, the struggle is the struggle to actually breathe. And of course, in those situations where somebody is having their breathing compromised, of course that's a medical emergency. But what we've also seen, and I think there's a reference to the death of Kevin Clark, is that there are situations where medical staff have failed to intervene in a more timely way, and have effectively given control to police officers rather than recognising the life-threatening situation that somebody's in.
And you've seen that pattern emerging in the evidence available to INQUEST.
Mm-hmm.
We've touched on the issue of feigning, medical assistance, first aid and matters of that sort. As a body that has experience of these matters, has INQUEST reflected and concluded any views as to how that situation could be improved in relation to perhaps lack of first aid, or a delay in providing first aid, a delay in recognising a medical emergency?
I mean, I think at inquests and in coroners' reports, prevention of future death reports, or what previously used to be known as Rule 43 reports, some of which I've provided to the inquiry, there have been recommendations, or certainly suggestions to police and health about some of the things that could be changed. And indeed, a lot of the evidence that we heard as part of the Angelini review, I mean, one of the things I think was so important about the Angelini review was the fact that it looked into these issues in depth, and we had meetings with health, with police, with families, as you've already heard, and there were a whole series of recommendations that were very much designed to try and stop this pattern continuing, and across all deaths, not just deaths, obviously, of black people. But as I think I said earlier on, I think if you're talking about people in mental health crisis or otherwise in crisis, it's really important that there's a recognition that these are people who are in potential serious risk, not least if restraint is applied, and that knowledge is well known.
Thank you. Can I move on to return to a topic we've touched upon earlier in your evidence, media engagement and misuse of information? Mm-hmm. If we look at SBPI 366, which we have on the screen, and paragraphs 60 to 65. And I think here you talk about common concerns about misinformation. There we are. The most common concerns that families report are the use of misinformation and spin, which has been a long-standing feature of many contentious deaths in custody. Families have regularly reported that before the involvement of the independent investigation started, the police force has very quickly sought to defend its position by releasing their narrative about events to the public before the basic facts have been established. There are numerous examples of this, some of which INQUEST included in a submission to the Leveson inquiry, in where we described a recurring issue of concern to bereaved families and the police who work with them. Misinformation following deaths involving the use of lethal force by the police. They highlighted that misinformation about such contentious deaths not only damages bereaved people, but it also undermines public confidence in authorities. Misinformation following contentious deaths makes it hard to allay any suspicions of wrongdoing and failures in the minds of bereaved families and the public at large. As well as obscuring the picture of what happened, misinformation fuels fears that the state is attempting to deliberately prevent information about its own culpability in deaths becoming publicly known. Many families have described how they felt that instead of the death of their loved one being investigated, it was their private life and that of their relative that was subject to the most scrutiny. Families regularly find, as well as promoting their own version of events, police sources have briefed the media with prejudicial, irrelevant, and in some cases inaccurate information about the deceased, intended to besmirch their reputation and blame them for their deaths to deflect attention away from the acts and omissions of officers or public bodies, instead of focusing on problem or dysfunctional families and the deceased criminal or antisocial behaviour. If I can stop there for a moment, you talk about the deceased, the family and the public. Could I ask you about what themes you've seen emerging regarding the deceased, first of all?
So, I think effectively trying to blame the deceased for their own death by reference to drugs, purported violence, gang involvement, a whole kind of series of, depending whether you're talking about, if we're talking about black people in particular, black men in particular, that kind of very, very powerful and racist trait that we see about, gang engagement, gang involvement, drugs, and by focusing on the alleged violence of the person who died. So in a sense, before the investigation is really, carried out or there's been any conclusions made, reference to information that is an attempt to other or to, to focus on the deceased's alleged criminal behaviour rather than on the fact that somebody has died in a really disturbing way that warrants proper scrutiny and investigation.
So you mentioned tropes, and you've mentioned a
Yeah.
number of themes that you've seen emerging.
Yeah.
Gang involvement, drugs, and the violence or
Yeah.
criminal behaviour of
Yeah.
the deceased.
And
Are
mental
those-
health, and mental health,
And you've
is
seen
another one.
common themes where those issues are
Yeah.
given as part of a narrative.
Yeah.
And then for the family, can you help the chair understand what themes or patterns you've seen emerging in relation to how they're portrayed or how they're dealt with?
I mean, I think I come back to this in my my later statement. But you know, families who ask who are asking legitimate questions after a death, being seen as as troublesome or difficult, or and then communities. I think I said before that there are a pattern of deaths in particular communities, particularly in London, where I think communities themselves who perhaps will protest and will ask questions of police as to what's happened are effectively also criminalised by the very fact the fact that they're asking and trying to actually understand what has happened, and those are, in my view, very legitimate questions, and they're questions in the public interest. But the state does do, and the police in particular do attempt to deny and deflect when those questions are asked. And for families, I think, particularly for bereaved families, I think it's extremely difficult when you are grieving to then see your loved one and attempt to demonise your loved one for something that has happened following their encounter with police officers.
And you mentioned in paragraph 62 about families feeling they're subject to the most scrutiny. Yeah. Can you explain that?
I mean, I think what often happens following an investigation is that families feel as if the investigation is as much focused on them and their loved one rather than on what happened to their loved one, in or following police custody, and the kind of resource that's put into effectively scrutinising the family and the person who died, I think sometimes feels disproportionate to the investigation that's being carried out into those in whose care or custody the individual died. And I suppose it goes back to an earlier point, which is, about kind of that when families find themselves involved in these processes, too often they experience that attempt to somehow dismiss their legitimate concerns or to try and blame the person who died for their own death. And I would suggest that with Sheku, some of that media representation about his alleged assault on a female police officer, and his purported violence, and the information about drugs that came in, just to me characterised what we've seen so often when it comes to these deaths. And I think what it does as well is it creates in the public mind, and it creates that idea of an undeserving victim, and when that information enters out into the kind of public arena, it's very difficult to challenge it. Not least when, as we know, these processes are protracted ones.
Touching on, you've talked about the state. In paragraph 62, you talk about fears misinformation fuels fears that the state is attempting to deliberately prevent information about its own culpability in deaths becoming publicly known. I'm interested in that aspect. Is that a pattern that you've seen emerging from a number of these deaths?
Yes, absolutely. Because there's, if there's an attempt to smear, the character of the deceased and their family, and there's a lack of, openness and transparency about what's happened, and if the investigation is not doing the job that, the public at large and that legally it should be doing, then I think that what you then see is an attempt to explain away what's happened, rather than understand how and why it's happened, and importantly, how to stop it happening again.
Can we move on to the next paragraph, 64? You say families reported having to defend not only their loved ones but themselves against racialised stereotypes from the outset, and how they faced negative media reporting and inaccurate police statements that started in the immediate hours after a death had occurred. Can you help us understand what you say there about they're not only defending their loved one but themselves against racialised stereotypes?
Well,
have you noticed a theme in the circumstances that INQUEST have dealt with, that families are facing racialised stereotypes in their dealings with the institutions of the state that they're involved in?
Yeah, and I mean, I think I've reported on this in terms of through the family voice, because I think I need to be very clear here that my evidence, as I've tried to say, is based on working alongside families for a very long time, and the team at INQUEST, do that day-to-day work, and families that we meet with regularly, that is exactly what they describe this as being like, and about the way in which they're spoken to, and particularly the way in which when they, in my view, rightly ask questions about what's happened, they are seen as difficult or hostile, or and also they also, I think people forget that when something like this has happened, it's the worst thing that can happen to a family, and you're not only trying to deal with the post-death kind of religious or cultural practices that then follow, you're also trying to navigate a very unknown, complex, and quite hostile process. It's not easy, and then to find that you're almost having to kind of explain and justify your reason for asking questions about what happened to your loved one. And that's certainly something that families report and continue to report. This isn't something, sadly, that has changed to the way it should have done.
And then finally, paragraph 65, you've talked about the introductory lines there, but you say, we have no doubt that police statements to the media in the immediate aftermath of a death in police custody and during inquest processes play a key role in undermining families' confidence in the process. Worse, they can hamper the system's search for truth, and in the most serious cases, lead to the promotion of an accepted public narrative of events that is simply untrue, but which families find it hard to dislodge. The focus of a police force typically becomes how to defend its actions rather than to assess whether in fact its actions fell short of expected standards and what learning and improvements can be made. And does that touch on what you've been saying, that there's less of a focus on improvements and understanding, but more on defensiveness?
I mean, absolutely, and I've already, I've described that kind of culture of defensiveness, denial, and delay. But I think my concern is that police tend to see the investigation and inquest or FAI process in this context as about reputation management and about defending policies and practices rather than, and of course, we have to also remind ourselves that, Article 2 requires an effective investigation that is capable of identifying, what happened. But it, importantly, it should also be there to ensure learning and accountability because, at the end of the day, the rule of law does apply to police officers. And I think that, the processes that we've seen, and it's not INQUEST, only INQUEST who have, who have been critical about some of these processes. This is not an area that is without its research, both academic, official, Home Office research, and it's been the subject, deaths in custody, police custody have been the subject of numerous reviews and parliamentary inquiries. But, I still, find the fact that what these processes, in my view, are too often focused on is explaining away rather than properly understanding what went wrong, how improvements and changes can be made to stop this happening to somebody else. And of course, it goes without saying that that's not just in the interests of, bereaved families that we work with. It's in the interests of the public at large, but also it's, of course, in the interests of police officers who have to go through these processes.
And so you do say specifically there that in relation to this topic of media engagement or misinformation, it plays a key role in undermining families' confidence.
Yeah.
And that is the trust and confidence they have in the investigation and the outcome.
Particularly where they see that the police misrepresenting evidence. And I believe in my in my last statement, I give the example of the more recent death in London of Oladeji Omishaw, a man who was tasered on a bridge in London, where the Metropolitan Police put out a statement saying that he was armed with a screwdriver, which of course immediately conjures up that image in one's mind, when in fact it was a cigarette, one of those fire lighters. And the family had to then try and get them to retract that information. But by then it's in the public consciousness. It's out there.
And I'd like to turn on to page 28, please. This is one section in your statement where you talk about best practice. And I'd like to go through the 4 items that you've listed here. A, consideration should be given to preventing a police force whose officers' actions are being considered in an independent investigation from commenting on the matters in issue to the media at all. And if changes were implemented along those lines, what impact do you think that would have on families?
Well, I hope there would be a little bit more trust and confidence in the fact that there's an investigation being undertaken, and that police forces are not prejudging the outcomes of that information. Prejudging the outcome of that investigation.
Thank you. And then B, there should be no contact between the local force and bereaved family where an independent investigation is to take place, and they should be the main source of contact after a death. Where this is felt to be necessary, it should be agreed with the IOPC and family lawyer. I think the equivalent of the IOPC in Scotland is PERC.
PERC, yeah.
And do you think having no contact between the local force and a bereaved family would be of benefit to a family?
I think so, yeah.
And why do you say that?
Just because I think, again, it's about trust and confidence. There's an independent investigation taking place, and that's what families need to look to in effect be doing that investigation without having any engagement between. It's unnecessary to have any engagement with the force and the family, and that doesn't mean that you can't treat somebody humanely from the outset and offer condolences. But in effect, the independent investigation is what the state has given the family as their means to find out what happened.
And then C, any press release to be issued by the PERC should be agreed in advance with the family of the deceased. Mm-hmm. And tell us what benefits you think that would bring.
I mean, the first thing I'd say was just to make sure that it's accurate. I mean, we've had examples of press releases going out with misspellings of names or ages or, and so, basic information, but also to make sure that it's a neutral press release containing information that isn't going to further distress the family by reference to information that may well be incorrect or be found to be incorrect.
Then D, inappropriate media briefings by the police should be commented on in the independent investigation and should be considered as a misconduct issue. And that would be briefings, when you say by the police, are you thinking there of individual officers or Police Scotland
I'm thinking
as a body, or even the Scottish Police Federation?
All, I would suggest. I mean, I think it obviously it's dependent on individual cases, but it should apply to anybody who's given inappropriate media briefings.
Thank you. And we can move on from that. I'd like to move on to SBPI 607, and I'll be looking at paragraphs 25 and 26. In this regard, you've mentioned the deceased being demonised, family life being and the family being scrutinised, and the impact. I'm also interested in considering whether this extends to the legal advisors who may be assisting and supporting the family. If we look at paragraph 25, first of all, you'll see around fifth line, 5 or 6, 5 down, it begins, I am also aware of this through. Do you see that?
Yes.
I'm also aware of this through the undercover policing inquiry, as some of the families, their campaign groups and their lawyers were spied on after deaths in custody. If they don't just go for the families, then they'll also try and go for their lawyers. Reflecting on my involvement with Sheku, I worked very closely with the family and Amar, particularly in the early stages. Amar contacted me because he knew of our work on deaths in custody, particularly on restraint-related deaths of black people. And he sought advice from me because of my expertise. And then you go on to describe that, and we've talked about that. And then at 26, you say, what I've seen happening to Amar over the years is there's been an attempt by the police, investigators and some of the media to demonise him for the work that he's been doing. Mm-hmm. Bear in mind that for many years Amar Anwar was working pro bono in the absence of public funding. He was trying to ensure that the truth about what happened came out in the family and public interest. As an Asian lawyer, he has been subject to the institutional racism seen in regard to other black and brown lawyers who take on the state, where you try and undermine them despite the fact that what they're trying to do is ensure the most robust scrutiny of what's happened. I think it shows just what the resistance is when deaths like this happen, to ensuring that they are investigated without fear or favour and in the interests of justice. And I'm interested in any patterns or themes emerging that INQUEST have identified, where not just the family of the deceased, not just the deceased or the family, but their friends and other family members and perhaps even their lawyers are being demonised in that way.
I mean, I think, firstly, I'd say in regard to Amar Anwar, obviously I know, because I've had contact with him since the outset, how hard, he's been working in the absence of public funding. I think there's a perception often about lawyers that, that there's kind of I mean, if you talk about tropes, you know, this idea of the fat cat lawyer, when in fact so many of the lawyers that I've worked with over decades have done a lot of this work, you know, for no money whatsoever, and particularly in the absence of legal aid funding for these cases, which is, of course, in real contrast to the fact that public funds pay, you know, for the state to be represented. But that aside, what I saw with Armour and have seen with you know, other lawyers is the fact that what they are doing is trying to represent the best interests of their families, to try and ascertain the truth about what's happened and to try and make the investigation processes do the job that they are supposed to do. And of course, you know, for many, that's seen as that can be seen as highly problematic, because effectively it's also scrutinising the quality of the investigation and the way in which those investigators are conducting their work. And so I've seen the kind of hostility to lawyers being involved in my work for a long time. But I think when you are a black or Asian lawyer, then, you know, the reality of racism is that you see it in, you know, all organisations and all structures. And I think it's quite easy to try and then target individuals. And I was quite, if I'm being, you know, very honest, I was very shocked to find out, you know, the experience that Armour was having. And, you know, maybe it is because, you know, he is somebody who has, you know, been out there. He has a media presence. He's involved in highly significant cases, particularly around, you know, institutional racism. But, you know, I think that it's absolutely kind of abhorrent that you have a situation where a lawyer who is doing the right thing for their families are then themselves, you know, targeted for that kind of, you know, behaviour and that kind of demonisation that we've already talked about in the context of the person who's died, but also their families.
And do inquests see a difference in situations and the impact on the lawyers and the demonisation of the lawyers if the person who has died is black or if the person who has died is white?
I mean, I think I think I would say I may well be corrected. I mean, I am aware of other lawyers in England and Wales who've experienced similar treatment, but perhaps not more recently. I mean, obviously, I referenced the undercover policing inquiry, but obviously that has a particular time period. But you know, I think the experience that Armour has, I would suggest, is unusual in my current experience.
And as well as we've talked about demonisation, including of the lawyer, are there any other examples, not simply demonisation in the media, are there any other examples of behaviour towards or a narrative presented towards the lawyers representing families of someone who's died that you're aware of from your experience?
Well, I think what I said before in response to that question, which is around, you know, lawyers are raising the legitimate concerns of their clients that they represent, and that's a really important role, particularly where there are concerns with the way in which these investigations have been carried out. And some people find that really difficult and find it that somehow it's, you know, it's judging them for what they're doing. But of course, it's a really important role because, you know, families put their faith in their lawyer to, you know, play for them to play a meaningful part of the investigation. And so to then be treated with, contempt or to be, dismissed for what they're trying to do in their client's interests is not acceptable, because families have the legal rights to be represented throughout these processes, and the law is very clear on that.
Thank you. I'd like to move on to another topic, which if we look at SBPI 366, paragraph 70, you touch on this. This is issues regarding post-incident management, difficulties and delays in obtaining statements from officers. Paragraph 70, you've said, as the Home Affairs Select Committee said in its report in 2013 on the IPCC, the issue of interviewing officers in cases involving death and serious injury is indicative of a culture of treating officers differently from members of the public. When officers are not interviewed promptly under caution, this can lead to weaker evidence and loss of confidence in the process of investigating serious matters such as deaths in custody. The application of the threshold test for special requirements should be reviewed so that officers are routinely interviewed under caution in the most serious cases, exactly as a member of the public would be. And this was the Home Affairs Select Committee. I think you've referenced it. You've given the link at the bottom in a footnote, 15. And you talk here about a culture of treating officers differently from members of the public. And I'm interested if INQUEST has noticed that issue emerging in cases that you've been involved in. A perception that the police are being treated more favourably than members of the public.
I mean, I think that would be the overriding experience of the families that we work with, and certainly Chime. I mean, the Home Affairs Select Committee, I think, have done a subsequent report to this, where the same concerns about police officers, particularly. I mean, it comes back to a point I made earlier on about the unwillingness to approach these deaths as if a potential crime has been committed, so that police officers are treated as witnesses and not potential suspects. And I say that not implying that all deaths, are the result of police officer criminality, but it needs to be proven to be otherwise, and particularly where you have a death following restraint, it's absolutely vital that police officers are interviewed in a timely way. And what we see is that this can drag on for an extremely long time, and in fact the taking of witness statements can often be frustrated by the Police Federation and the lawyers instructed. And of course for families, the idea that an ordinary citizen who has been involved in a situation resulting in death wouldn't be interviewed in a timely manner, I think that's what leads to some of the kind of lack of confidence in the processes for holding police officers to account. And as I said, has been the subject to a number of inquiries.
And from the perspective of INQUEST, would it be appropriate to treat those very serious cases of involving deaths in custody or deaths after police contact, Article 2 investigations, in perhaps a different way to other types of case?
Yeah. Not least where a death is, where police contact has resulted in death, and restraint-related deaths are a very clear example of that.
And do you think if that was done, that would, to some extent, rebalance this perception that officers are treated differently from the public and perhaps have an impact on public confidence?
Yes, but and also it might assist the timeliness of these processes, because as we've discussed, they can be subject to serious delay, and some of that delay can come because of the refusal of police officers to give statements under legal advice. You know, I say that, but you know, I mean, I think the quote of the Home Affairs Select Committee probably does sum it up. But it's also, I think, it's what one should expect from the processes for holding the police to account. That, you know, where this has resulted in death, that, you know, we need to see those processes deliver the accountability that you know, we demand from the police. They, as I said, the rule of law applies to them as equally as it does to a citizen.
Can we turn to paragraph 74, please? And again, you talk about something in the Home Affairs Select Committee, but this time in February 2022.
Thank you. That's the latest
that's the one
inquiry that I was talking about.
Yeah.
And I gave evidence to this committee, as did a member of our INQUEST lawyers group. So it was a kind of more recent inquiry, effectively saying the same thing. That non-court.
And you've given a quotation there. Is this from their report?
Yes. Yeah.
There is a clear absence of urgency and a culture of non-cooperation from some police forces involved in investigations.
Yes.
Is that a perception that you've become aware of from families or the public more generally?
Well, I think it's a perception from families, but it's also the reality of families. And you know, I think it's important to note that's 2022.
Yeah.
The previous inquiry was 2013, and most recently I was on a reference group to a review of the IOPC. Sorry, I maybe it's in my statement somewhere, I can't remember, but and again where that whole that whole issue about police officer statements and accounts, and the subsequent paragraph I think is also important, which is around, you know, when police officers make their first accounts, and you know, the importance of separation of police officers when something like this has happened.
Let's look at 75. Very significantly for families, the IOPC often miss the opportunity of ensuring that officers write their early first accounts without collusion, or ensuring that any debriefing meetings are not merely an opportunity for officers to rehearse their evidence in front of each other, getting their story straight before recording their accounts. Police officers are usually the only witnesses to key events preceding the death, and the integrity of their accounts is therefore critical to the integrity of the investigation overall. So long as officers remain together following a death, many families will have suspicions which undermine their faith and confidence in the investigation. Correct. Concerns about officers' need for support and welfare considerations can be fully addressed by any relevant person to meet those needs, so long as that person or persons were not witnesses to the relevant events. And here do you explain that this situation can undermine, again, trust and confidence that the family have in the investigation?
Yes.
And more generally, what is the impact for families in this situation about this inability or delay in securing accurate information about what happened?
Well, I think the fact that the very people in whose care or custody their loved one was in, and the failure to make available that information, you know, I mean, you can only imagine what that's like on an emotional level, but in the context of the fact that, you know, families have to look to the PERC in Scotland, the IOPC in England and Wales, for them to conduct the investigation, to then know that timely evidence has not been taken, does undermine their confidence in the ability of those investigations to get to the truth. And, you know, I think that that's one of the really one of the really frustrating aspects of our work is the fact that, when something like this happens, it takes a very long time, and families, have to wait, and the state, has control of all the information. The families weren't there, and so it's very hard to then know that the very people who were there are not giving statements, or are not. It's the kind of absence of the lack of candour, I think, is really difficult for families to understand.
Thank you. If you could give me a moment, I'm conscious of the time. Would that be?
We'll stop for lunch and sit again at 2 o'clock.